India today fields one of the most capable and professional air forces in the world, equipped with modern fighters, surveillance aircraft, refueling tankers, and a rapidly improving network of air bases and radar coverage. Yet beneath this impressive surface lies a vulnerability that rarely features in public debates about national security. A vulnerability that could decisively shape the outcome of any major conflict or regional crisis. Before we move forward, please like, subscribe, and share Strategic Vanguard, and be up to date with the latest news and happenings from the world of defense and strategic affairs. Tune into our video channels in Rumble and YouTube. And if you want to hear the audio version, please tune into Strategic Vanguard Deep Dive in Spotify. Vulnerability is heavy strategic airlift, the ability to move large numbers of troops, armored vehicles, artillery systems, helicopters, engineering equipment, and humanitarian supplies rapidly across thousands of kilometers, day after day, under both peace and wartime conditions. At present, the backbone of India's heavy airlift capability rests primarily on just 11 C-17 Globemaster III aircraft, supported by a diminishing fleet of aging IL-76 transports. And while these aircraft have performed exceptionally well in operations ranging from disaster relief and evacuation missions to rapid troop deployments and high-altitude logistics, the reality is that the size of the fleet is far too small to sustain prolonged high-intensity operations, especially when viewed against the backdrop of India's expanding strategic responsibilities, its 2.5 front security doctrine, and its increasing role as a net security provider in the Indian Ocean region. The C-17 Globemaster III is without question one of the finest military transport aircraft ever built, capable of carrying main battle tanks, heavy artillery, and large troop contingents directly into forward airfields, including short and semi-prepared runways, and it has given the Indian Air Force an unprecedented ability to respond quickly to both military contingencies and humanitarian disasters. Whether it was delivering relief supplies after earthquakes, evacuating Indian nationals from conflict zones, or reinforcing border areas during periods of heightened tension. Yet, for all its excellence, the C-17 fleet in Indian service is simply too small in number. And more importantly, it represents a closed chapter in global aerospace manufacturing. Boeing shut down the C-17 production line several years ago, after fulfilling the final orders from the United States and a handful of allied nations, and reopening that line would require massive financial investment, new supply chain contracts, and guaranteed long-term orders, none of which are realistically on the table in the current global defense market. Meaning that for India, the C-17 is not a platform that can be expanded in meaningful numbers in the future. And over time, as airframes accumulate flight hours and maintenance demands increase, sustaining even the existing fleet will become progressively more expensive and more complex. Alongside the C-17, the Indian Air Force continues to operate the IL-76, an aircraft that has served the country for decades and has proven its ruggedness in a variety of operational environments. Yet these aircraft are now well beyond their original design lifespan, with many airframes approaching or exceeding 4 decades of service. And while avionics upgrades and structural refurbishments can extend operational utility to a degree, they cannot reverse the fundamental realities of metal fatigue, rising maintenance cycles, and declining availability rates, all of which reduce the number of aircraft that can be relied upon at any given moment during a crisis. This creates a strategic paradox where India's demand for heavy airlift is steadily increasing, driven by both military and non-military commitments, while the supply of available and reliable heavy transport aircraft is gradually shrinking, a trend that becomes particularly alarming when one considers the nature of modern warfare, where rapid mobilization, flexible logistics, and sustained resupply are often more decisive than sheer numbers of combat platforms. Because armies that cannot move, reinforce, or sustain themselves quickly lose operational momentum, regardless of how advanced their frontline units may be. India's security environment today is fundamentally different from what it was even 2 decades ago. with persistent tensions along the northern borders, ongoing instability in the western neighborhood, growing maritime competition in the Indian Ocean, and an increasingly complex geopolitical landscape in the Indo-Pacific region. And in such an environment, the ability to shift forces rapidly between theaters, reinforce remote outposts, and sustain forward deployments becomes not just a supporting function, but a core pillar of deterrence and warfighting capability. The concept of a two-and-a-half-front scenario, involving potential simultaneous pressures from multiple directions along with internal security challenges, places enormous strain on logistics networks, because forces may need to be redeployed quickly from one sector to another. Equipment must be moved over vast distances, and reserves must be positioned in advance to respond to unexpected escalations, all of which depend heavily on strategic airlift, especially in regions where road and rail connectivity is limited or vulnerable to disruption. This challenge becomes even more pronounced when considering India's island territories, particularly the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which occupy a critical position overlooking some of the world's busiest maritime choke points, and which play an increasingly important role in India's maritime surveillance, deterrence, and power projection strategies. Yet sustaining military infrastructure on these islands requires a constant flow of equipment, fuel, construction material, and personnel. And in times of crisis, sea lines of communication could be contested or delayed, making airlift not just convenient, but essential for maintaining operational readiness. Beyond purely military considerations, heavy transport aircraft are also indispensable for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, an area where India has consistently demonstrated leadership across South Asia and the wider Indian Ocean region, responding to earthquakes, cyclones, floods, and other natural disasters with rapid deployment of medical teams, relief supplies, and engineering units, all of which rely heavily on the availability of large cargo aircraft capable of reaching affected areas quickly, sometimes under difficult airfield conditions and with limited ground infrastructure. In addition, as India's global footprint expands through diplomatic missions, peacekeeping operations, and the protection of its overseas citizens, the demand for rapid evacuation and logistical support capabilities continues to grow, as seen in recent years when Indian aircraft have conducted complex evacuation operations from conflict zones and politically unstable regions. Missions that require not just political will and operational planning, but also sufficient aircraft capacity to move large numbers of people and equipment safely and efficiently. Given this expanding demand, the natural question is whether India can simply procure additional heavy transport aircraft from the global market to bridge the gap. But here the options are far more limited than they might initially appear. Because the global heavy airlift market is extremely small, highly specialized, and dominated by only a handful of platforms, most of which are either no longer in production or come with strategic and logistical complications that make them unsuitable for long-term reliance. With the C-17 production line permanently closed, the most obvious Western option is effectively off the table. And while some have speculated about the possibility of restarting production, the economic and industrial realities make this highly improbable, especially when even the United States has shifted its focus toward upgrading existing fleets rather than investing in new heavy airlift programs, leaving countries like India with no realistic pathway to acquire new C-17s in significant numbers. Turning to Russia, the newer IL-76 MD-90A variant does represent a theoretical upgrade over older IL-76 models, featuring improved avionics, stronger airframes, and more efficient engines. Yet in practice, Russia's aviation industry faces substantial challenges due to international sanctions, supply chain disruptions, and shifting industrial priorities, all of which raise serious concerns about long-term spare parts availability, maintenance support, and upgrade pathways, factors that are absolutely critical when operating large and expensive transport aircraft over several decades. India's own recent experiences with sustaining Russian-origin platforms across multiple domains have already highlighted the risks of dependence on external supply chains during periods of geopolitical tension, and extending that dependence into the core logistics backbone of the armed forces would introduce vulnerabilities that no responsible military planner would be comfortable accepting, especially when alternative solutions must be evaluated in terms of reliability, political resilience, and long-term operational sustainability. The only other major heavy transport aircraft in current production is China's Y-20, a platform that has significantly enhanced the People's Liberation Army's strategic mobility and allowed China to project power more effectively across its vast territory and beyond. Yet for India, the very idea of sourcing strategic airlift capabilities from its primary military competitor is fundamentally incompatible with national security imperatives, not only because of political considerations, but also due to concerns about software integrity, avionics security, maintenance dependencies, and the broader risks of embedding foreign systems within critical defense infrastructure. This leaves India in a strategic position where none of the existing global options can reliably meet its long-term heavy airlift requirements, and where the gap between operational demand and available capacity is likely to widen over time, unless a fundamentally different approach is adopted. An approach that treats heavy transport aircraft not as an imported commodity, but as a strategic national capability that must be developed, sustained, and evolved within the country's own industrial ecosystem. Developing an indigenous heavy transport aircraft is undoubtedly a complex and resource-intensive undertaking, involving challenges in aerodynamics, structural engineering, propulsion, avionics, material science, and manufacturing processes that go far beyond those encountered in light or medium transport aircraft programs. Yet it is precisely these kinds of challenges that define whether a nation can claim genuine aerospace sovereignty or remains dependent on external suppliers for the most critical elements of its military infrastructure. Such a program would not merely be about producing a single aircraft model, but about building an entire ecosystem of suppliers, design expertise, testing facilities, and certification processes capable of supporting continuous upgrades, variant development, and long-term sustainment, much like what India has gradually built in the domains of missile technology, naval shipbuilding, and space launch systems, where initial investments eventually led to a mature and increasingly self-reliant industrial base. The most formidable technical hurdle in any heavy transport aircraft program is the development or acquisition of high-thrust turbofan engines, capable of delivering the power required to lift extremely heavy payloads while maintaining efficiency and reliability over long operational lifespans. And unless India can make significant progress in this domain, it will continue to face some degree of external dependence. Yet even partial indigenous capability, combined with diversified partnerships, could substantially reduce strategic vulnerability compared to complete reliance on foreign platforms. From an industrial perspective, such a program could act as a catalyst for advancing composite manufacturing, precision machining, avionics integration, and systems engineering across the broader aerospace sector, creating spillover benefits for both civilian aviation and space applications, while also strengthening collaboration between public sector entities like HAL and DRDO and private firms such as Tata, L&T, and Mahindra Aerospace, which have already demonstrated growing competence in complex aerospace manufacturing projects. Critics of indigenous heavy aircraft development often point to long timelines, cost overruns, and technical risks, and these concerns are not unfounded, because large aerospace programs anywhere in the world are inherently complex and susceptible to delays. Yet it is important to recognize that reliance on imports carries its own hidden costs, including foreign exchange outflows, limited upgrade flexibility, vulnerability to geopolitical pressure, and the strategic risk of having critical military capabilities constrained by external political decisions. Moreover, the financial investment required for such a program must be viewed not only as defense expenditure, but also as industrial investment, because much of the funding would circulate within the domestic economy, supporting high-skilled jobs, research institutions, and advanced manufacturing capabilities that can serve multiple sectors over time, thereby contributing to broader economic and technological development beyond the immediate military application. There is also a strong civil strategic dimension to heavy transport aircraft capability, because platforms designed for military use can often be adapted or leveraged for civilian disaster response, large-scale evacuation operations, and even specialized commercial logistics tasks involving oversized or sensitive cargo, making them valuable national assets during peacetime as well as conflict, and reinforcing the argument that such investments serve national resilience as much as they serve defense preparedness. In the long term, if India were to successfully develop and field its own heavy transport aircraft, it could also position itself as an alternative supplier for countries that are unable or unwilling to procure Western aircraft, and that have reservations about Chinese platforms, particularly in regions such as Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of the Middle East, where strategic partnerships are evolving and where demand for reliable airlift capability is growing alongside peacekeeping and humanitarian missions. Such export potential would not materialize overnight, and it would require sustained commitment to quality, support infrastructure, and diplomatic engagement. But it represents a strategic opportunity to expand India's influence through defense cooperation, while also achieving economies of scale that help reduce unit costs for domestic procurement, creating a virtuous cycle of production, improvement, and market expansion. Ultimately, the question of heavy transport aircraft is not about prestige or industrial symbolism, but about the very foundations of military effectiveness. Because without reliable logistics, even the most advanced combat units cannot be sustained, and in modern conflicts where speed, flexibility, and endurance are decisive, the ability to move and supply forces rapidly becomes a core determinant of strategic outcomes rather than a secondary consideration. As India continues to modernize its armed forces, invest in indigenous fighter aircraft, expand its naval presence, and strengthen its missile and surveillance capabilities, it would be strategically inconsistent to leave the backbone of its mobility and logistics dependent on aging fleets and shrinking global supply options, especially when the geopolitical environment is becoming more competitive and less predictable. Heavy transport aircraft may not capture public imagination in the same way that stealth fighters or aircraft carriers do, but they are the silent enablers of power projection, crisis response, and sustained operations. And nations that neglect this dimension of capability often discover its importance only when it is too late to rapidly correct deficiencies. For India, the coming decades will likely involve greater regional responsibilities, more complex security challenges, and higher expectations from partners across the Indo-Pacific and beyond. And meeting these expectations will require not just strong diplomacy and capable frontline forces, but also the logistical backbone to support rapid and sustained action whenever and wherever it is required. In that context, the development of an indigenous heavy transport aircraft is not merely an option to be considered when convenient, but a strategic necessity that aligns with India's broader goals of self-reliance, technological advancement, and credible deterrence. And the decisions taken in the near future will determine whether India enters the next phase of its rise with full-spectrum military capability or continues to rely on shrinking and uncertain external sources for one of the most critical elements of national power. If India chooses to act decisively, invest consistently, and align its industrial, technological, and military planning toward this objective, it can transform a looming vulnerability into a long-term strength, building not just aircraft, but strategic autonomy itself, and ensuring that in times of crisis or conflict, the nation's response will never be limited by the simple inability to move its own forces where they are needed most. In the final analysis, wars are not won only by those who have the best weapons, but by those who can bring their forces to the battlefield, sustain them over time, and adapt quickly to changing paristhitia. And in that invisible yet decisive contest of logistics and mobility, heavy transport aircraft are among the most powerful strategic tools a nation can possess, making India's choice on this issue not just a matter of procurement policy, but a defining decision about the future shape of its national power.
Thank you for joining us on this Strategic Vanguard deep dive. If you found value in this analysis, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you fresh deep dives every Wednesday and Saturday here on YouTube and Rumble. And you can also catch the audio versions on Spotify and Amazon Music. Just search for Strategic Vanguard Deep Dive. For more insights, articles, and discussions, subscribe to our blog at strategicvanguard.com. Your support helps us grow and bring you more in-depth analysis on defense, geopolitics, and strategy. Until next time, stay informed, stay strategic.